The village had always whispered about dark things, but in 1995, when 14-year-old Hulo first heard the name Rose spoken in hushed tones, he didn't understand that some whispers carried curses within them. Rose arrived in their mountain village like a fevered dream made flesh. She came from Manila, where she had worked as what the adults called a hostess in Ermita, though none of the children understood what those letters meant. All they knew was that she moved differently than the other women, her hips swaying with a confidence that made grown men stumble over their own feet. She purchased the old bar from a former councilman, transforming the humble drinking house into something more intoxicating. Men would disappear inside for hours, emerging with glazed eyes and empty wallets, speaking of Rose's beauty and voices thick with obsession. But beauty, Hulo would learn, was the most dangerous currency of all. The trouble began when the older women noticed their husbands lingering too long at the market, their sons making excuses to walk past the bar, their sweethearts suddenly seeming plain by comparison. Rose's presence had shifted something fundamental in their small world, like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that would soon become waves. Among those who watched Rose with narrowed eyes was Madam Bebeng, a woman whose own beauty had curdled into something bitter and twisted. Once, she had been the object of men's desires, married to Mr. Legros, a fisherman whose hands were gentle and whose smile came easily. But when a young housemaid from Manila caught her husband's eye during her vacation in their province, everything changed. Mr. Legros left with the girl, abandoning his wife and their life together for the promise of youth and fresh skin. The betrayal didn't just break Madam Bebeng's heart. It shattered something deeper, something that could never be repaired. She retreated to a hut at the base of the waterfall, where the forest pressed close and the shadows never fully lifted. The old-timers said that place was cursed, that during the Japanese occupation, soldiers had dragged women there to be brutalized before being killed. Many comfort women had chosen to leap from the waterfall rather than endure another day of torment. The spirits of the violated and murdered had never left. In her isolation, Madam Bebeng's grief fermented into something darker. The locals began to whisper that she was practicing witchcraft, that she had made a pact with the demons that dwelt in the haunted grove. When Mr. Legros' body was found in Manila, his skin erupting with holes that spewed forth living maggots and cockroaches, the whispers became certainties. Hulo's friend Robert had seen his uncle's condition firsthand, and the memory would haunt him for years. It was like he was rotting from the inside out. Robert would tell anyone who would listen, his voice shaking with remembered horror. The insects weren't just crawling on him. They were living in him, eating him alive while his heart still beat. The healer in Manila confirmed what everyone already suspected. The curse had been cast by someone named Bebeng, and it was no ordinary hex. She had called upon a guardian, a demon that fed on suffering and grew stronger with each act of vengeance. When Mr. Legros' brothers learned the truth, they descended on Madam Bebeng's hut like a pack of wolves. They found her tending to jars filled with insects, beetles, worms, cockroaches, and centipedes, all writhing in a soup of decay and malice. "How nice of you to visit," she had said with a smile that never reached her eyes, her fingers caressing the glass containers as if they held precious jewels. The beating that followed was savage and thorough. They left her bloodied and broken on the ground, her face a map of bruises and split skin. But as they walked away, she began to chant in a language that predated Christianity, words that seemed to crawl through the air like living things. By the next morning, Mr. Legros was dead, having vomited gallons of blood before his body finally surrendered to whatever had been devouring him from within. The entire province learned to fear Madam Bebeng after that. She no longer bothered with her appearance, letting her hair grow wild and her clothes turn to rags. When she walked through the market, children would cross themselves and adults would avert their eyes. But her attention had turned to a new target, the beautiful newcomer who had stolen the devotion that should have belonged to women like her. The confrontation came on a sweltering afternoon in the marketplace, where the air hung thick with the smell of overripe fruit and human sweat. Madam Bebeng approached Rose with the slow deliberation of a spider closing in on trapped prey. "You bewitch them, don't you?" she asked, her voice carrying across the crowded stalls like smoke. Rose looked up from the vegetables she was examining, her beauty so radiant it seemed to dim everything around her. "Excuse me, bewitch who?" "The men. You steal husbands with your potions and your spells." Madam Bebeng's accusation hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Rose laughed, a sound like silver bells in the mountain wind. She turned away without another word, dismissing the haggard woman as if she were nothing more than a beggar asking for coins. But dismissing a sorceress, Hula would later realize, was like turning your back on a coiled viper. For weeks afterward, Rose continued her reign over the men of the village, unaware that jealous eyes were watching her every move, cataloging her routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Rose suddenly vanished from the bar, panic rippled through the community. The regular customers demanded answers, threatening violence if their goddess wasn't returned to them. Suspicion fell on Jamal, a motorized rickshaw driver who had been particularly vocal about his infatuation with her. The mob that formed was ugly and desperate, men driven half-mad by withdrawal from whatever spell Rose had cast over them. They forced their way into her house, expecting to find her hiding, perhaps held against her will. Instead, they found hell. The stench hit them first. A wall of putrefaction so thick it seemed solid. The smell of rotting fish mixed with gangrenous flesh and the sweet decay of death. They stumbled backward, retching, but curiosity and desperation drove them forward into the darkness. Rose lay naked on her dining table, her perfect skin marred by dozens of weeping sores. But the true horror wasn't the wounds themselves. It was what lived inside them. Cockroaches the size of thumbs crawled in and out of the holes in her flesh, their bodies glistening with pus and blood. Maggots writhed in the deeper wounds like rice in a bowl, and when she opened her mouth to beg for help, centipedes spilled from between her lips. "She's been cursed," whispered an old man who had seen such things before. "This is how my wife looked when the witchcraft took her." They wrapped Rose in blankets and carried her to their jeep, shocked by how heavy she had become. Her body felt waterlogged, as if the insects had made their homes in her very bones. She moaned constantly during the journey, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. The healer they sought lived on the far side of the mountain, in a white triangular hut that looked like a shrine from another century. Kamala appeared to be a child of perhaps 12, dressed in black with a white veil that made her look like a nun in mourning. But her eyes held the wisdom of decades, and the ritual blade she carried, a ritual dagger that had tasted blood in ancient wars, marked her as something far more dangerous than she appeared. She was waiting for them when they arrived, as if she had seen their coming in dreams or visions. A woven mat lay ready on the ground, surrounded by piles of salt that gleamed like snow in the lamplight. "Place her here," Kamala commanded, her child's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The moment Rose's body touched the mat, the salt began to smoke and hiss as if it were being heated by invisible flames. Kamala began her ritual, swinging the ancient blade in patterns that hurt to look at directly, chanting words in a dialect that predated Spanish colonization. As she worked, insects began emerging from the forest. Thousands upon thousands of them, drawn by whatever power was emanating from the cursed woman. They swarmed toward Rose, but couldn't breach the barrier of salt, which now glowed with a light that had no earthly source. Kamala cut her own wrist with the ritual dagger, letting her blood drip into a clay cup. The crimson liquid steamed as if it were boiling, and when she forced it between Rose's lips, the young woman's screams could be heard for miles. The insects fled then, disappearing into the earth as if the very ground had swallowed them. Kamala raised her blade toward the darkness beyond their circle of light and thrust it forward with both hands. Something in the shadows screamed, a sound that was neither fully human nor entirely animal, but something caught between the two. The voice carried notes of rage and pain, of a malevolence that had been wounded but not destroyed. 2 days later, fishermen found Madam Bebeng's body floating in the center of the waterfall pool, her stomach pierced by what appeared to be a ritual blade identical to the one Kamala had wielded. The authorities couldn't determine if it was suicide or murder, but those who understood such things knew the truth. The sorceress had paid the price for her dark magic. Rose recovered completely, her skin returning to its former perfection, as if the curse had never touched her. She even attended Madam Bebeng's funeral, the only mourner willing to stand beside the grave of a woman everyone feared even in death. But death, Hulo would learn, was not always an ending. The night after the burial, Rose returned home from the bar to find a familiar figure waiting by her door. Madam Bebeng stood in the shadows, her body still bearing the wounds from her brothers-in-law's beating, water dripping from her clothes and hair, as if she had just climbed from the waterfall. Rose fled to the church, spending the night huddled in the pews, while the priest burned incense and muttered prayers. But holy ground could only provide temporary sanctuary against the kind of hatred that transcended death. The hauntings began in earnest after that. Every night, Madam Bebeng would appear, sometimes floating outside Rose's window, sometimes standing at the foot of her bed, always wearing the same expression of malevolent satisfaction. She never spoke, but her presence carried a message as clear as shouted words: "You will suffer as I have suffered." Within weeks, Rose made the decision to sell the bar and return to Manila. The men of the village begged her to stay, but she had seen something in the dead woman's eyes that terrified her more than any living threat. The bus ride to Manila began uneventfully, but at 2 a.m, during a routine stop, a new passenger climbed aboard. Rose was dozing when she felt someone settle into the seat beside her, the smell of stagnant water and decay filling her nostrils. "Where do you live in Manila?" the newcomer asked, her voice carrying the wet echo of underwater caves. Rose mumbled a response without fully waking. But when she opened her eyes to see who had spoken, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. Madam Bebeng sat beside her, her skin pale and bloated from her time in the water, centipedes crawling in and out of her eye sockets as she smiled with lips that had begun to peel away from her teeth. Rose screamed and forced the driver to stop, fleeing into the night rather than spend another moment in that mobile tomb. She caught the next bus, and the next, each time finding new horrors waiting for her in reflections, in shadows, in the spaces between sleeping and waking. When she finally returned to the village 2 years later, the change in her was immediately apparent. Gone was the radiant beauty that had once made men forget their own names. In its place was a hollow-eyed woman whose arms bore the crosshatched scars of repeated self-harm. "She won't leave me alone," Rose confided to Jamal, who still carried a torch for her despite her transformation. "Every night she comes to me. She makes me hurt myself, makes me remember what I took from her." The local priests took Rose under their protection, recognizing that she was being tormented by something that wore the face of the dead, but carried the malice of pure evil. They explained that demons often masqueraded as the spirits of the departed, using familiar faces to gain entry into the hearts and minds of their victims. For months, they worked to break the connection between Rose and her tormentor, surrounding her with prayer and holy water, never leaving her alone with her thoughts. Gradually, the attacks lessened, the phantom voice in her head growing quieter with each passing day. When Rose was finally strong enough, she led a procession to the waterfall where Madam Bebeng had died, carrying blessed salt and holy water to cleanse the place of its accumulated darkness. The priest spoke words of binding and banishment, while Rose stood at the edge of the pool, no longer the frightened victim, but a woman reclaiming her power. The ritual seemed to work. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the waterfall for decades finally lifted, and locals began visiting the area again without fear. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries the smell of stagnant water, visitors to the waterfall report seeing two figures standing at the edge of the pool. A young woman whose beauty seems to glow in the darkness, and an older woman whose eyes reflect light, like those of a predator stalking through the forest. They never move, never speak, but their presence serves as a reminder that some hungers transcend death, and that beauty, true beauty, always comes with a price that someone somewhere must eventually pay.